One more snarky thing I noticed, like workflows can't trigger filter branches, roll eye emojis. What is that all about? Hey everybody, it's been a while, but I noticed that this channel keeps growing and I want to say thank you to everybody who continues to watch these videos and subscribe, and especially to those who leave comments letting me know how much impact this has on you. So today, while I'm kind of injured at home, I figured I would record another video, kind of unscripted, unplanned, so it'll be a little bit sort of choppy. But I noticed that you guys really like the Azure Pipelines YAML walkthrough video. So today I'm going to walk through another set of pipelines, real world, a bit complicated, and they're going to be for GitHub workflows. We're going to look at code reuse with custom GitHub Actions. We're going to look at reusing variables with templates. I'm going to deploy to both a dev and staging Kubernetes cluster. We'll look at GitHub Environments and secrets, best practices, as well as how I debug pipelines. So let's get started. Very quickly before we get into the walkthrough, I am launching a free email newsletter and a free email course at devopsinreallife.com. Head over there and sign up for free. As you can tell, it's pretty time consuming to create and edit these videos. So in order to be able to share, stories and knowledge with the community more regularly, I'm creating this newsletter. So head over there, that's devopsinreallife.com, and sign up for free. And I'm going to show you very quickly first what it looks like in the GitHub UI. So you can see I have actually various sort of pipelines here. One of the things that I like to do is I stick sort of emoji icons in front of stuff that, is the most important to me. Some of these things like the end-to-end tests, right? So I've made it so that I can't run it manually, I think. Yeah, I can't do it manually. I want it to always be triggered. And I have the little underscore in front of it to say, hey, this is just something that's reused. Ideally, I would like to hide this in the GitHub UI, but no, it's there. So if we look at the continuous delivery pipeline, right? So it actually has it linked here, but I'm just going to look at what it does. So this one, you can tell I merged a feature branch into the main branch. What it did was it set up some variables to figure out, okay, what cluster am I deploying to? What naming conventions am I going to use for tagging the image, etc. This runs no matter what. Some tests, some unit tests, code linting, etc. And after it's sort of figured out some variables, it can build the image. It will do a kubectl apply on the cluster. And then once that's done, I want to make sure it actually is deployed. And that is that little bit down here with the git SHA, right? Just sort of compare, did I really deploy that one? So I use the SHA to help me out a little bit. Let's go back to summary. Yeah, I just need to scroll down more. So this is going to be the part about how I debug some of the variables. None of this is super secret, right? I just want to make sure, okay, sanity check, I'm deploying, or I push to the main branch, it really is deploying to dev. And so I can just scroll down and have an overview of everything that is going to be used for configuration. So for the event, I also then put a table out. One of the things that's super annoying about GitHub, in my opinion, is sometimes you have ref name and it just says main, right? Which is the name of the branch. But sometimes you have the reference, which has, this is how Git says everything, refs heads main, right? Because you can also have tags, which isn't at the head of the branch. It's going to be further down. And so sometimes you just have to know what you're working with. And for me, this is like, okay, that's what I'm doing. I don't know why there's no ref type. But again, I built these pipelines a long time ago. I'm just going to walk through this with you right now on a Saturday afternoon because I can't go to the gym or I can't go climbing on rock. Okay, let's look at some YAML. So one of the things that I notice is people tend to say, oh, I have used GitHub Actions. I use GitHub Actions. Actions are like just those little components that you do to dry up your code. What you're actually making is workflows, right? I don't know why they didn't say GitHub pipelines, decided to call it GitHub workflows. But what you're actually running is GitHub workflows. So the actions are usually published by other people and you can consume them or you can make your own. So we just looked at a continuous delivery pipeline. So let's just start there. As I walk through it, we'll cover all the other little files in there. So you can see that I allow the workflow dispatch, right? So in the other one, remember I said, oh, there's no button to click and enable it. If I go back and check really briefly, continuous delivery, there's a button here that says, hey, you can run it manually, right? And it'll say which branch do you want to use, etc. I also have here the push trigger, right? So for the push trigger, I'm looking at, okay, which branch did it push to? I don't want you to deploy feature branches. I actually only want you to deploy if it's the main branch or the staging branch. The main branch corresponds to my development cluster. So stuff I don't care about, I don't want you to actually build or do anything. Basically things that have no effect on the application when it comes to what the user is actually seeing, right? My end users. So if I forget something in the change log, whatever, I don't need to put that in the Docker image. That might be different depending upon your business use case. So when I used to work in corporate insurance, that would be different. Because you want an accurate record in every application of what's in there. So I would have to actually rebuild the image and redeploy, even though from a user perspective, nothing changed, but that's corporate insurance. Okay, so I have two branches, right, to correspond with two different environments, main and staging. You can see the next thing I did is in terms of concurrency, right? So what happens if I actually make multiple pushes or whatever, and it's going to say, okay, it's stuff that's in progress, we're actually going to cancel it, because if I'm going to build images and deploy them, do I care about the 3 that are building right now or from the past? I just made a new one, right? So I just care about that one, so I'm going to cancel the ones that are in progress. So that's what that does. The next thing that we need is the ID token, right? So the ID token has to do with the fact that I log into the Azure Kubernetes clusters without a password. So that uses an Azure feature called Manage Identities. That all works with crazy OAuth stuff behind the hood. Crazy as in it's complex. I'm not going to explain it in this video. I think there's another video where I explain it. So that's why that is there. I need that for basically credentialless login to a Kubernetes cluster. While we're looking at that, might as well look at the login right now. So somewhere in here, there should be for deployment, a login step, right? So it actually says deploy. And you'll see that the first module that I created, or custom GitHub action, is something called kubelogin. And you'll see that this is where I'm going to log into the Kubernetes cluster in a secretless way. You'll see here things like secrets, right? So they're stored in Azure, they're stored in the GitHub UI as quote unquote secrets. But you'll see that actually, in my case, these are just identifiers, right? So this would be the client ID, so the headless credential, just the ID, no password. Azure subscription ID and Azure tenant IDs, none of those are actually passwords. So if we look at the kubelogin action, what is it actually doing, right? So if you're using Azure Managed Kubernetes, you kind of actually need to do 2 things, especially in my cluster, it is Azure Active Directory integrated, which means you have to have an Azure account. So the first thing I need to do is log into Azure, and then I actually need to log into the cluster management plane or the control plane. And the way that works is what we do here is we take your Azure Active Directory login token and you merge it with your kubeconfig, right? Which is how you communicate with your Kubernetes control plane. And so that's kind of what this does. Sorry if it's not the best explanation ever. I haven't looked at this in ages. So here you can see what the action has, right? So it does take some inputs. I need to know which cluster are you referring to. Resource group is an Azure specific thing, right? Because you can have many clusters with the same name. So which cluster are you talking about, or just how the Azure API works? I need a resource group. The most important thing here is the location of the kubeconfig file, right? I need to know this location because later when I do a kubelogout, I actually want to delete it. So remember, in this config file, you have an OAuth token. And even though OAuth tokens expire, and the default for Azure Active Directory is 1 hour, and these are shared agents, right? So these are GitHub hosted agents and they are recycled after each run. But because I come from compliant industries, like, I'm going to delete that anyway. before the pipeline run is finished. So that's why I want to know where that file is. And you can see as well, I set that location where I put it, right? And I use not just kubeconfig, which would be theoretically enough. I want kubeconfig with the dash and what is the name of the cluster. It's just, I'm like super pedantic. I'm debugging, kubeconfig tells me nothing. If it's kubeconfig.-dev, okay, I know exactly what I'm looking at. Maybe it's deploying to the wrong cluster. So super pedantic, that's me. Ugh. So you'll see here, there is an installation of a CLI. You need to log into Azure first. You're getting an OAuth token. You're putting that OAuth token into your kubeconfig, because when you log into the Kubernetes control plane, it's going to say, do you have access? And it's going to check that token. So I'm creating a custom config. You'll see that I also need to give it sort of permissions. I'm going to overwrite and tell it exactly where I want to put it. So that I know where it is, and then when I do the kube login, I guess it's going to convert the Azure CLI into a kubeconfig for me. I'm just telling it where it is. To confirm that I actually properly logged in, I just do list all the pods for me, so then I can just see like it's kind of there. So that's what the kube login does. Now, if we look at kubelogout, right, it's going to say, hey, where is that kubeconfig? And the only thing I do is I say, okay, let me delete that. I'm going to delete that file, right? That's in my working directory. And I'm also going to remove the tokens, right? So the tokens will be somewhere else. It's going to be in your user directory. So again, I'm using GitHub hosted agents, and they are recycled. So, you know, nobody else is going to get these tokens, but this is just sort of like best practice, super disciplined. If you work in a large organization and you have self-hosted agents, this is where this might be an issue, right? If you know where those tokens are, then you could find them in the next pipeline run if you wanted to, or if you're just like me, kind of, you know, a jerk trying to find holes, security issues. Yeah, so that's how we covered now code reuse in terms of custom GitHub actions. I could theoretically publish this, right? So that I don't need to have this action.yaml in the file. I didn't do that because it's only me using it, so maybe somebody else did it actually, but do I care? Not really, because I want to focus on just deploying my application. I want to build this cloud review application. Whether or not these actions are published, I don't care. Now that we know how to log into an Azure Active Directory integrated Kubernetes cluster, right, and where we put our kubeconfig with our OAuth tokens, and do some housekeeping, clean that stuff up, don't leave secrets lying around. Let's go back to the pipeline and what it was actually doing. So I know I jumped from CD into deploy, but let's just go back to the top and go sort of a little bit more sequentially so that you understand how it works. So, okay, that was the OAuth token bit. Now we have here CI, right? So continuous integration. I have that in a separate file. If we look at CI, you can see, hey, I disabled something and I put a comment in to tell myself in case one day I'm like, oh, I forgot this, let me put this. No, it says don't check branches because CD calls the CI workflow. Okay, so I won't do that. I do want pull requests, however, to run this, pull requests against the main branch. And you can see as well, I run this weekly. Now, why would you run it weekly? Well, even if you don't change anything. So sometimes if you have CI that checks, your dependencies, do you have security issues, you want that running like regularly anyway. You might as well also have like NPM issues depending upon the granularity of your dependency management, what type of versions you have. So I just let them run regularly in case stuff happens. You'll see as well, okay, does it still build? So I think recently I had an issue where the Alpine image, it changed at some point and actually couldn't build anymore. So I just run it regularly every now and then. So for this particular one, you'll see that I have some caching set up. So, you know, if you don't use Node.js, you'll know, well, you don't use Node.js. I'm telling you now, there is a node modules folder, which is insane. It has so much stuff in it. That's Node.js. It's how it works. But it can actually make your build take a really long time. So this will cache it so that they run a little bit faster. So that's what this first sort of step is. And then I would just do an install, right? So CI is the CI version that it doesn't sort of try to say, hey, here's some new dependencies. It'll be more strict about, okay, what is in your package lock, and let's just install those. So I do what is the audit. So this checks as well for any security issues that you might have. And then I'll say continue on error. One of the things I really miss, I know Jenkins can do it, I think Azure Pipelines can as well, is I don't want to just have red, it failed, and green, it's good. I want to have it in between, like, hey, warning. And so this one, right, it's going to be green, even if there's an issue, which means I actually have to go and read into the detailed results to see if this failed. Right, so this is audit level moderate. So if it's moderate, fine, like I'm just going to let it continue. Depending upon your industry and your requirements, if for severe errors, right, this fails, you might want to just kill the pipeline and say, nope, we're not allowed to continue because our security team won't let us. So the rest of this is pretty straightforward. Like I said before, I still want to check that things can build, even if I don't publish them. Let's just see if it can build. So that's what CI does. Okay, I'm gonna go through this config YAML file that I use to set various variables that depend on which environment I'm targeting, right? Which is based on each branch name. Relatively quickly, because I don't like it. It's kind of like messy. I looked at when I wrote it originally, and I think the oldest timestamp is about May 2022. So almost a year ago. I don't like it. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a better way to do it still, even almost a year later. My preference is actually the way it's done in Azure Pipelines. So let me just zoom in really quickly. So for the different pipelines that I have, I can actually load variables from other YAML files. And there is a way to do sort of precedence, right? So I can load the global variables first, which are kind of like the defaults, right? So these are Azure DevOps specific, but you can just see I'm setting a bunch of variables. If I pull the dev one after that, then I'm going to set these variable names, which are very specific to the dev environment, right? And then I have a production version, right? And these are different names of the resources I have in Azure. Now, the reason why I like this is it's in code. It is as close as possible to the developer and what they're looking at. Before I go into detail why this is a little bit sort of like nasty down here, especially, if you look at the GitHub docs and in terms of how they expect you to do that, so this is their page about variables and stuff like that. I needed to pass it across steps as well as potentially jobs. And so somewhere over here, defining for multiple workflows. So it says using vars context, right? If I click on this, no, not this one, then I think it's this one. So what GitHub wants you to do is it wants you to use the UI. And I do use the UI, so this is way too big. But if I come over to settings, I do have environments here, and I can sort of set secrets, variables, etc. This is set, if I go into my staging environment, right? And staging here is just a logical and a security boundary. You'll see here that somewhere I have secrets and I have variables, and I can add them here. I don't want to click through and find out what I'm looking at. I just rather have it in code, especially if it's a variable. It's not a secret. So secrets I do put in here, and actually things that that are not necessarily secret, right? It's an identifier to expose the client ID. I put that in secrets, but my variables I don't want in the UI. I'd rather have in my code. So given that I am pedantic that way, right, I'm optimizing for debugging, which is why I want to see it as quickly as possible. The code that you need to get this done, and as far as I know, it hasn't really changed based on what that doc said. I don't think it can get much prettier than this. All right, so you'll see that I do set some variables up top, and the intention here is that if these things sort of change, I can just change it in one place, and then it will propagate down everywhere. You'll see that some variables are set lower in the YAML, and there'll be things like, okay, the prefix here is dev dash or staging dash. Those are unlikely to change, so I don't care if it's down there somewhere. The reasons why this might change is, so these are random suffixes that are generated by Terraform, because these clusters, I can bring them up and tear them down all the time. So this will change this name, and I just want one place where it's easy to find that. I might change the FQDN. I might, just pick a different name, for example, and I want to change that in one place. And if I change it for one environment, I'm probably going to do it for all of them. So the stuff that I want to sort of change, it's going to be all up here. Scrolling down a little bit, you'll see that I have here the outputs, and the outputs are stuff that I say, here you go, and the workflow that's calling it. So in this case, it's cd.yaml. They can use these things, right? So resource group, URLs, etc., hostname, git SHAs, yada, yada, yada. You'll see here I have for jobs, there's one that says sets up all the variables. It just does the output thing again. Actually, no, the output is just I put it at the top, or it belongs at the top. Here are all the different steps. So I have to check out the code. I'm going to grab the git SHA, right? So this is a shell command. And by doing echo, here's the name of the variable, and then putting that into the GitHub environment, then I can refer to it later. So later I have references of git SHA. You can see here env.git SHA, right? And the only reason why I can do that is I did the echo. Here's the name of the variable, and you can see I took git SHA and just put it in Docker tag. It has the dev dash beforehand, and I'm also just putting it into the GitHub env. So probably the very last one is, yes, here are all the outputs that I have. And you can see that I'm taking those variables and I'm also putting them in the GitHub step summary and the GitHub output. Or rather, I'm putting them in the GitHub output, and then I'm writing a nice markdown format, which you saw in the UI I showed you earlier. That's going into the step summary. So, this part is a little bit pedantic. It makes my life easier. Yes, it's markdown, but you do it once and it's fine. Oh, I put some footnotes in here. Maybe it changed, but this works. So basically, you'll see that if it's the dev environment, I'm checking for the branch, right? So this is the main branch. If it's staging environment, I'm checking for the staging environment. The one there refers to the footnote down at the very bottom. It might have changed, it might not have. I don't know. So that's kind of how I set the environments. Again, not my favorite. I prefer the Azure pipeline way. So this is the Docker job, and it requires the config. So I need all those variables set first before I run anything. And you'll see that I'm passing this to a Docker YAML file. I'm giving it the environment name, the image tag, and the git SHA. And here's some secrets. So let's look at the Docker workflow a bit more in detail. I love how it says maybe it should be required, the git SHA. Here I don't right now. So let's see. We have here, the environment is going to refer to GitHub Environments, which I guess I can show you actually right now. And these things are required. Here's some variables that I set just for building the Docker images. So this is the Azure Container Registry, right? This is the name of it. And the format for the tags is going to be the FQDN, and then the, what do we call them? I think we call them repositories. You can think of it as like a folder. But Azure Container Registries, we call them repositories. You will constantly see something that's called an environment. What is an environment? So an environment, a GitHub environment, is, as you saw that I had this open. It's basically a logical grouping for variables, right? So there used to be this thing called secrets. It still exists. But as you can see now, it's kind of like, it's a bit convoluted. Part of it is that when GitHub bought Dependabot, it was like, okay, wait, so it's not part of GitHub, but does Dependabot automatically have access to your secrets? Which is why there's a separate thing just for Dependabot, another separate thing just for code spaces. But let's look at actions, because this was way back when, before GitHub had the environments feature. So what you can do is these are available at the repository scope. So regardless of which workflow is running, right, you'll always have an Azure tenant ID, Azure subscription ID, etc. If I wanted to set a default client ID, I could put that down here. And again, the client ID is basically the name or identifier of the headless account that is used to deploy to the Kubernetes cluster. What the environment thing does, which is kind of nice, is that I don't need to say Azure Dev Client ID, Azure Staging Client ID. I can use the same variable name, right? And the only thing that will change will be the GitHub environment. Now, so again, these are repository scope, which means they don't change. If this is for a external service, so here I have Sneak, or here there is Azure Defender, that's going to be the same regardless of whatever environment that I have. Okay, this is also a security boundary, because what I can say is this grouping of variables, I'm going to actually tie it to the deployment branch. So only the deployment branch can use these credentials. Now, if this was production, right, this would be really key, because a developer who should not have access to production environments, right, you would control that by saying, okay, this developer cannot push to the production branch. Otherwise, if you have a bunch of variables that are just saved at the repository scope, right, you can't differentiate between access to production and access to non-production unless you can tie it to branch protection. So yeah, here you can see, like it said, it can also you can also save variables in here that won't be masked, right? That won't be asterisked out in the output, but I don't like clicking through the UIs. I'd rather just have it in YAML. Easier to debug. So that's what a GitHub environment is. Okay, now that we know what a GitHub environment is, let's come back to this Docker YAML file. So I have a job, it's called build and push. So what I want to do is build a Docker image and push it to Azure Container Registry. Because I'm pushing to Azure Container Registry, that's why I need to log in, right? If you're pushing to Docker Hub, you're going to have the equivalent of logging into Docker Hub. When you log into Azure Container Registry, these are the things that you also need to provide. So then I run the login command. I'm old school. I run the Docker build command. So for a bit I used, but this was like a preview thing. You can see here it's like V0 and I've disabled it because it's completely changed. And so that's why I had here the app insights and the Defender tokens. What I did have is, or I do have, is the, from Sneak. They can also scan Docker images, so public Docker images or public repos like this one. And I also added a continue on error, because yeah, at some point maybe something doesn't work. Now that I see it says security threshold is high, but I'm going to continue on error. And that's what it does. So after that, I also do, me being me, I do a Docker logout. So I'm also going to log out of the container registry. It's only 2 lines of code. Just get used to always logging out of things, and you don't have to be as concerned when you suddenly have to run your own CI/CD infrastructure and you have self-hosted agents. Then I'm always logging out. There's nothing lying around for you to grab, right? That was the Docker job for the dev environment, right? So for staging, I don't want to build the image again. I want to take the image, right? I want to make sure it's immutable. So I take the tag, or rather I pull the dev image by its tag, retag it so that it is now the staging image, and then I push that up to my container registry. So you'll see the same sort of login step. I'm going to pull it, right? It has the dev prefix, right, before the git SHA. And when I retag it, the FQDN is the same, right? And remember, the image name includes the FQDN and the repository, as Azure calls it. And I have dev dash, and I'm just going to do, actually here it says image tag. So why does it say image tag? That must have staging in there somewhere, right? Okay, that means I put it here. Image tag, Docker tag, yes. So that's why it's so convoluted. It is in the config. So if I wanted to know what does my staging tag look like, it's going to be in the config. The reason why I do Docker pull, Docker tag, Docker push is, I grew up cloud native. I grew up, not working for a cloud provider. And I'm a huge, huge believer in you should know how these things work, right? So looking at this, I want you to know that in terms of, wait, it's moving from one registry to another. How does that work? It's just the tag. The tag has the fqdn in it. Okay, now we're going to deploy the images that we've built and pushed to our registry. So we're back in our cd.yaml, and you'll see that it calls a deploy YAML file. I think the most important thing here is this concept of overlays, right? And so I use Kustomize. It's much simpler than Helm to basically have different versions of my YAML for my Kubernetes clusters. So let's open up deploy YAML. You'll see that I want all these variables that I've fed into it in cd YAML. So going through the actual jobs and steps, we're going to, as usual, check out the code, right? Because I need the manifest YAMLs. I'm going to log into Azure. I'm going to then log into the control plane of my Azure Kubernetes cluster using kubelogin, which we walked through at the very beginning of this video. And now I'm going to do the fun part. I'm actually going to build the YAMLs and then do a kubectl apply to actually then do the deployment. And you'll see that from the kubelogin, I need to know exactly where that kubeconfig is, because here is when I am doing kubectl. Now, if I'm not mistaken, kubeconfig, that variable, the name of that variable is part of kubectl when you install it. So that's why you won't see me referencing it other than setting the variable in this particular step. You'll see as well that I guess I'm a little bit paranoid. I only want to run this step if I am on the main branch and if I am on the staging branch. Let's look a little bit at what this actually does, right? So let's go to the repo. I should be here, yes. What I'm gonna do is super lazy and just do kustomize and see what were the things that I recently did. Oh, I didn't have any. Actually, what I should be doing is, there we go. So kustomize, build, and then I have a environment substitution. Actually, that's not going to work because the environment variables will not be set. It works in that it does spit out YAML, but stuff's going to be missing, right? So you see here, the app build SHA is not there. This is just using a default. The tag here is missing. If I'm not mistaken, I usually have an end file, probably this one. So if I were to type the command fully, it would be .env.dev. So I tend to just type this, but what it'll do is it will set those variables. Let's hope that there's nothing secret in there. Yeah, so this is what it looks like. You'll see these are the variables that my pipeline are going to expect to exist, so I can run the customized build. So it's just a dev tag, it's just a git SHA. The assumption is that it exists. Why did I write that? I don't know. So let's go back to customize build. So this time when I run it, right, you will see that it has actually the complete tag. So after the container registry fqdn, I actually have properly the repo and the tag here. Now I also have app build SHA set. Now there are various ways to do this. If you're running GitOps, you're going to be actually writing this YAML file and committing it to a repository. I don't do that. I don't need it. For this application, I don't want it. And so you'll see that's why I do if I just do this, all right, it will build this file based on the overlays. What that means is actually if I do this, right, you will see that for dev, I only have a deployment YAML. I don't have namespace YAML. I don't have service YAML, etc. It's going to do some customization on top of these based on whatever I'm defining here. So that's why I do a build. When I do a build, I'm going to get all these different YAMLs, right? And that's what you see here, separated by the 3 dashes. So these are all the Kubernetes resources I need to actually deploy. So going back to the pipeline, you'll see that I take this, pipe it over to environment substitution so that I have all the values in there, like the full tag of the container image I want deployed. And then I'm passing it to kubectl apply. I'm passing it a file, and the file is actually just the string that's being fed into it. And so this is how I'm deploying. So again, if you're using GitOps, you're going to be actually generating actual files. You're going to be checking them into a repository so that your GitOps operating on your cluster can pull the things. So it's not just me that's tired. The battery died. So now it's plugged in and I have some coffee. But let me finish the GitOps thing. So the reason why I don't use GitOps in this repo is that it's additional complexity and operational overhead that I don't want. I would need to create another repository or have it automatically check stuff into this repository. I don't want that. Okay, we're almost done here. At the end of the deployment, we're going to log out, which you saw before. I'm just removing the kubeconfig with the OAuth token so that, security-wise, I'm good. I've done some housekeeping. So that was the deployment step. Now there's also an end-to-end step, which I'm going to go over. So what does this file look like? Yeah, I'll just open it here, actually. E2E. End-to-end test. So what this does is I'm using Selenium, so it fires up a headless browser, and I tell the browser to go check the website. And actually, where do I have the test? Don't do that. Test, deployment tests, probably this one. Yes. So it's super simple. All it does is actually it pulls up the health check endpoint and it looks for that build SHA. You can make things that are much more complicated. So I used to be a front-end engineer, and we would write stuff that actually clicks through the application to make sure it does exactly what it's supposed to do. You don't necessarily have to do all of the different features you have. Normally what you would do is just do the happy path. Otherwise, tests that take 5 hours to run are not that useful. So you make trade-offs, which are the ones that you need. So going back to the YAML, it's pretty straightforward, right? I check out the code. I definitely need Node. Okay, I'm going to get the cache directory. I don't have to install all that stuff, fun stuff again. I do need to install the Chrome driver, so it's headless Chrome. And then, this is funny, wait 3 minutes. Wait for Docker and Kubernetes to catch up. And so where this will take time is that, yeah, I haven't built the images yet, and Kubernetes is just like, give me your YAMLs, give me your YAMLs. Or actually, no, give me that image, right? I did the kubectl apply, so it's already looking for a new tag, but that new tag doesn't exist yet. And so I wait 3 minutes, and then I try twice to run the end-to-end test, because sometimes it just, it takes a little bit longer. And you can tell here, earlier I said, GitHub doesn't do warn. It only does red and green, bad and good. Doesn't do anything in between. So if we go back to actions, what that looks like in the continuous delivery pipeline. Actually, I need to click on one to show this little picture here. So you'll see that the kubectl apply, this will finish relatively quickly. And this is done in 25 seconds. This will take 2 minutes, which means for, a minute and a half, it's going to try to grab an image that doesn't yet exist. And that's why here I'm like, let me wait 3 minutes. And then you can see the test only ran about 30 seconds and then it was done. So that's what that is. Okay, one more snarky thing I noticed, workflows can't trigger filter branches, roll eye emojis. What is that all about? So if I click on that, you'll see that I referenced an issue. But also this makes me also want to do, I thought I could just for push, I could filter which branches. So I only want this workflow to run when it's deleting a feature branch. Apparently does not work. So leave it as a comment. Don't always just delete everything, because otherwise future Julie will be like, oh, let me just do this. Now I know it doesn't work. I've linked to why it doesn't work. And what I've done here instead, and it must be in a different commit, this one just shows the comments. So I have to manually check. If it's a cleanup, it's running on the delete event. I want to double check it's the delete event. And I only want to run this if it is a feature branch. So yeah, roll eye emojis. Yeah, so that is kind of like this pipeline. Ooh, if I'm zooming on the mouse, it does that. So that is the pipeline for this repository. I hope you felt, wow, I'm that tired. I hope you found this video helpful. So again, the application is public. I'm sort of playing with it every now and then. I used it for the longest time, mostly for DevOps demos. I wasn't actually working on functionality for the application. I am now. So if you want to follow it for that type of stuff, that might be fun. And then, yeah, just poke around. You can see if I can talk through something I wrote like almost a year ago, right? Okay, 7 months ago, then you should be able to use this and figure it out. If you can't, leave a comment below, let me know, and I try to get through all of them. I'm not the fastest person in terms of responding, but I really do try to respond to everything. Yeah, so that's it. I will catch you on the next one. If you really like this video, please subscribe and consider also watching my Azure Pipelines YAML walkthrough, as well as the other videos, what YouTube thinks you would like.